Yes.
So before the break, Professor, I was asking you questions about those group of patients who, your concerns about the notification of that group of patients who received blood components, red cells and the like, from donors who'd then gone on to be diagnosed with VCJD. And we looked at a letter where you were drawing a distinction between that group of patients and the group of patients who had received blood products made from plasma pools to which one of those donors who'd been infected with VCJD had contributed. And I just want to pick that point up with you and ask you whether or not you had any concerns about the fact that that group of patients, that the group of patients that received plasma products, factor 8, factor 9 and so on, whether you had any concerns about them being told that they were at low risk of developing VCJD as a result of having factor 8, factor 9 and the like products, plasma products, contributed to by somebody that developed VCJD. Sorry, that was rather a long question.
We thought at the time, on the basis of the available evidence, that the risk to that group would be substantially smaller. But again, it's very hard to quantify what that risk is. With the very small group of patients that had received whole blood transfusions from infected donors, it seemed to me pretty clear that that represented a substantial risk. Quantifying the risk with blood products is of course intrinsically very complicated in terms of exactly how many units were pooled to extract those, what procedures were used in the extraction, whether they would have affected the distribution of prawns in any infected unit and so on. So I think that was much more difficult, but likely to be of a lower order of risk.
And to be clear, those that are listening, this is an issue I'll be picking up with Professor Ironside and indeed Dr. Nikki Connor next week, because they were involved with the notification procedure and the decisions that were made in relation to that. But in terms of your views, you say at the time you felt that risk was lower. Has that anything happened since then to cause you to change your view in relation to that?
Well, there has been a case reported infected from blood products since that time. You appreciate I'm not an expert in blood transfusion and blood products, so I really haven't been involved in the sort of blood product side of things, really, whereas the small group of patients exposed to individual donors were clearly, I think, more within our remit as neurologists in that their risks seem to be quite high.
And so I think you're referring there to a patient with haemophilia who at post-mortem was discovered to have disease prion in the spleen. Is that the case you're
Correct,
referring
yes.
to? But no evidence of prion, disease prion in the central nervous system or in the brain?
I wasn't involved in that investigation, but that's what I understand, yes.
And have you had, referred to your clinic, have you treated any patients who have received these implicated batches of pooled plasma for prion disease, VCJD?
No, not for disease. I think we have seen patients who wanted to come and talk to us for counselling purposes, but I don't think we've seen anyone with the disease that's developed.
And I'll pick that point up with you when we come to the end of your evidence about the DDA test. I'm now going to turn then to your role in the steps taken to reduce the risks to the blood supply. I'm going to start with the decision that we've already touched upon, made in 1997 by Frank Dobson, then Secretary of State for Health, 6th of November 97, to extend leukodepletion to blood and blood products as a precautionary measure. And we've seen the SEAC advice, the written SEAC advice that was given to the government at that point, and you've given us some evidence about how you came to be called to give direct oral advice to the Secretary of State. So can I just ask you, just so that we can all understand what we're talking about here, can you just give us a very brief explanation as to what leukodepletion is?
Yes, I mean, obviously blood is a complicated fluid, but in simple terms it's mainly fluid, plasma, but there are red cells which carry the oxygen around the blood, and there are white blood cells which are essentially part of the immune system. We considered that on the basis of the available evidence at the time, that a lot of the infectivity was likely to be cell associated, white cell associated, so leukodepletion would probably not remove all the infectivity from blood, but would have a substantial effect. That was our assessment at the time. So there was available technology to filter out the white cells from blood before it's transfused. And indeed, a number of countries were already doing that routinely in their blood supply, not related to variant CJD, simply because it has other advantages. It reduces transmission of some viruses, for example. It reduces unwanted immunological reactions, so-called graft versus host reactions that some people get after receiving a blood transfusion. It actually also increases the shelf life of blood. So some countries were doing that anyway, and the technology is well established to do that. And so that was the advice, to reduce the risk of transmitting variant CJD and cause, secondary variant CJD.
And we saw in the written statement of advice from SEAC that it was described by SEAC as a precautionary approach. Can you explain to us why it was a precautionary approach, the advice to leukodeplete at that stage?
Well, at that stage, there'd been no documented transmissions of variant CJD by blood, or indeed any other route other than primary infection from BSE exposure. So I think in that context, it's often referred to as acting on a precautionary basis, because the actual degree of risk at that stage couldn't really be quantified.
And it couldn't be proven that blood did indeed transmit VCJD. To that extent, it was a theoretical risk at that stage.
You could call it a theoretical risk, yes, but given the extent of colonization of the lymphoreticular system with Prawns in patients, it was a reasonable assumption that there would be infectivity in blood. And if you're giving someone a transfusion of a whole unit of blood, it seemed to me that was likely to be a significant risk.
And can you recall whether there was any discussion or what the about giving on SEAC or any thinking in your own mind about giving advice to the department, to the two sponsoring departments of SEAC about taking precautionary measures? Was there any concern about going that far?
From recollection, I don't know how much of that's in the SEAC minutes, but from recollection, there was discussion about whether this step was necessary or appropriate, and it was based on extrapolating largely from animal data about which components of animal blood in certain models had infectivity, and that suggested that a significant fraction was white cell associated, but certainly wasn't entirely in the white cells. I think when I discussed it with the Secretary of State, we were thinking in terms of it at least reducing the risk by 50%, hopefully more. Thankfully, we haven't seen a case of secondary transmission since leukodepletion, so it looks as though it was extremely effective.
And how you've told us that Frank Dobson, on the very day, I understand it, that you were speaking to him, made the decision to leukodeplete the blood. But how receptive was the government or Department of Health at the time to the advice you were giving on a precautionary approach? Well,
they were obviously asking SEAC for advice. In terms of my direct interaction with the Secretary of State, he asked very sensible, searching questions, wanted me to present all the evidence to him as far as it existed at that time, and wanted my personal opinion as to what to do. And I think he was very effective and impressive. A lot of his senior civil servants were in the room at the time. I think they were suggesting, more consideration ought to be given to it. I think they were surprised how quickly he took the decision. I didn't know at the time, but he told me later, he was our constituency MP, and he visited the unit actually quite often once the unit was set up. And he told me actually after the meeting with me, he'd gone across the road to see the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to get the funding to do that. And it was, Mr. Blair agreed immediately, and the decision was taken that day. Yeah, obviously it took some considerable time to implement. There's quite a lot of logistics the blood service had to manage, but he was very decisive, I think.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about the work that you've done on decontamination of surgical instruments. So just to try and understand why this is important for those that are having instruments that are being used for high-risk surgery, for high risk for VCJD. Can you explain to us what the issue is in terms of the cleaning or decontamination of surgical instruments? What surfaces are most susceptible to prolonged contamination with prions?
Well, we've known for a long time that classical CJD can be transmitted by instruments. There was a particular case which highlighted this in the literature from the 1970s when depth electrodes that were used to investigate a patient with epilepsy were used a neurosurgical procedure, and it had not been appreciated at the time that that instrument had been used on someone who, well, I should say that procedure was done on that patient not knowing that they had CJD. It subsequently emerged that they had CJD. In the meantime, the instrument had been sterilised using their normal hospital sterilisation procedures. This was in Switzerland twice, and used on 2 subsequent patients, and both those patients developed CJD. And the instrument was then subsequently retrieved and sent to Dr. Gadjusek's laboratory at the NIH in the United States and implanted into the brain of a chimpanzee, and it also killed the chimpanzee. It's after multiple rounds of normal hospital sterilizations. So that was the first evidence for that, and there have been some other examples of so-called iatrogenic CJD as a result of contaminated surgical instruments. With classical CJD, of course, the risk is principally concerns operations on the central nervous system, because that's where all the prawns are. But obviously in variant CJD, there's more of a concern because other tissues around the body, including blood, seem to contain infectivity. In terms of the surfaces, we were asked by the Department of Health, as were a number of other laboratories, the Department of Health, because of the heightened concern from variant CJD, that we may see more surgical instrument related transmission of the disease, because, as I say, the prawns will to some extent survive normal hospital sterilisation. They survive normal autoclaving reasonably well. So they had a call for proposals for research to develop new means of sterilising instruments that would remove prawns from instruments. So we obtained a grant from the Department of Health. We're one of, I don't know, probably there must have been about 20 different research groups working on this. I know we had regular meet conferences together where everyone shared data. We actually developed a model in the unit of prawns binding to surgical stainless steel. And we were quite surprised, actually, experimentally, how efficiently the disease could be transmitted by prawns adherent to surgical steel. They stick very avidly to the surface. They don't come off, really, and can very efficiently transmit the disease. So we set about looking at, having that model, we set about looking at novel means to remove prawns from metal surfaces. This was quite a demanding set of research. These are not simple issues. We reasoned that the best way of doing that was likely to be some sort of mixture of enzymes that break up proteins, together with things that sort of enabled those enzymes to access all the surfaces, so, you know, containing detergents also. And we looked at, from memory, about 400 different combinations of proteolytic enzymes that break down proteins. and found a combination that was particularly effective and used fairly cheap and readily available enzymes. So effectively what we developed is, you think of as a sort of biological washing powder, but now for one that gets rid of prawns. And we also developed sensitive assays because it was important to know by what order of magnitude, nothing's 100%. We needed to know what level of decontamination our methods produced, when we could show it reduced the prawns on metal surface by about 1 millionfold, which was quite sufficient to ensure safety, in our opinion. And so, that was a successful piece of research, I think, from the unit to do that.
And the concern is, if you don't have effective decontamination, that anybody with asymptomatic VCJD who is infectious because the lympho-reticular system has been infected and the blood is infected, may contaminate the surgical instrument involved in their surgery, and then that may go on to infect the person that uses it afterwards, because usual hospital decontamination procedures are not efficient.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's right to understand from your statement that your decontamination method that you've just described to us has not been adopted by the NHS.
No, that was right. I mean, we developed the technology, we published it, but obviously, we're just academics. We're not a company, and we needed a company that works on decontamination products to take that forward. And fortunately, we were able to interest DuPont, obviously a major chemical company, and they had an existing product called Relion, which was used in hospitals, and they wanted to see whether they could incorporate our technology into Relion to produce a sort of second generation product, which became Relion PI for prawn inactivator. And indeed so we did some additional work with them on that, and that produced something that was very successful. So DuPont turned that into a real product you could buy, but the NHS didn't use it.
And do you know whether the NHS does have an effective decontamination process for prion? So
far as I'm aware, there isn't a specific prawn decontamination or decontaminant that's being used. There was an overhaul of, SEAC looked at the time at hospital decontamination practices, and the Department of Health did an audit of hospital decontamination practices, and a lot of problems, I should say, were uncovered by that. I think they had a sort of traffic light system, and there seemed to be an awful lot of reds. And I can't remember all the details of this, but from memory, I think the Department of Health invested several £100 million in upgrading central sterilisation services at a number of hospitals to get them up to the standard that was expected. But that wasn't about specific prawn decontamination. It was about getting them all up to best practice levels.
And so the position, do you know what the position is now in relation to how a surgical instrument that has been used on somebody who is at risk for public health purposes of VCJD is dealt with?
Yes, there's an algorithm from a Department of Health document. I think that's one of the documents you have, which takes clinicians through a sort of set of steps as to what to do depending on the risk status of the individual and the type of operation, whether it's involving high-risk tissues, the brain, the spinal cord, the back of the eye in particular, or whether it's a low-risk tissue, and the algorithm takes you through what you do in those circumstances, whether it's okay just to proceed in the normal fashion, or whether instruments need to be quarantined pending a definitive diagnosis in the patient, or indeed whether instruments need to be destroyed.
And the inquiry has heard evidence that those kinds of measures, having to quarantine or destroy instruments, have led to some patients being unable to access healthcare because NHS Trust has not wanted to be put in that position. Have you heard similar stories from patients and those that you've met?
Yes, we come across this not uncommonly where patients are, it's an educational process that colleagues are concerned about the risk status and aren't sure what to do. So that's one of the roles of the National Prawn Clinic. We can help advise in that circumstance and ensure that the patients get the appropriate care they need, and the clinicians are supported to understand what procedures, what precautions need to be taken.
But presumably, if your product had been adopted by the NHS, then those quarantining and getting rid of instruments wouldn't be required. Is that right?
Correct, and I don't know all the details, but I understand there have been some major quarantining of very expensive sets of instruments, neurosurgical instruments, from time to time, particularly in circumstances where the hospital may not have been sure which set of instruments was used on a particular procedure, and they've had to quarantine them all. Another concern, of course, is, and we do see patients in clinic who've been notified they're at potential risk from exposure during surgery, and we see them for counselling and can usually offer them reassurance. The risk is likely to be extremely small, but nevertheless, it's disappointing that, as you're implying, that we didn't simply employ a means that would have solved the problem, and the patients would never needed to have been informed because there wouldn't have been a risk.
So it's your view that if the NHS had adopted either your method, your effective method of decontaminating surgical instruments, or another method of decontaminating surgical instruments, all surgical instruments, there would in fact have been no need to have carried out the notification process, notifying those patients who have received plasma products and who are at low risk of developing VCJD, because they wouldn't have needed to take public health precautions. Is that am I understood?
Well, there would still be public health precautions, for example, that people shouldn't be blood donors, shouldn't be organ donors. They're also advised, as you say, to inform surgeons and dentists of their status before procedures. But I think if we had effective prawn decontamination of instruments, then that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, there would have to be relevant risk assessments. There may be some procedures where you may still want to use disposable instruments, for example. But I think generally it would have removed much of the problem, yes. So
it would have been one less issue for that group of patients to be concerned about, and to have to inform clinicians about when they were seeking treatment and so on.
Yeah.
Can we look at a letter that you wrote to Professor Sir Michael Rawlins, the chair of the National Institute for Clinical Excellence? It's PRIU 5084. This is a letter we can see dated the 22nd of February 2011, and it's actually the second half, the lower half of the document I want to look at. You asked about our prion decontamination work. This was completed a couple of years ago, and we licensed the technology to DuPont, who produced a product Rely on PI. It was designed as a simple 10-minute pre-soak at 50 degrees centigrade. Temperature hot water comes out of taps in NHS, and measurably reduces infectivity on metal surfaces by 6 logs, and then you enclose the paper. To my knowledge, this is yet to be used at all in the NHS. Clearly, it's been hard to keep DuPont interested in these challenging times, and I suspect they will terminate this product. I'm afraid it's hard to escape the conclusion that nothing will happen until secondary VCJD caused by contaminated medical or surgical instruments is confirmed. Happy to brief you on the efforts my colleagues and I have put into this issue, if you have a few hours to spare. And it was just that penultimate sentence I wanted to ask you about. Is this a change in attitude on the government's part to that you were describing in 97, to accepting advice on a precautionary basis? And here you seem to be saying, well, actually, your view is that steps won't be taken until there's been an infection.
That was certainly, as I'm sort of implying there, I'd sort of felt I'd been banging my head against the wall for quite a long time, yes, in fact I recall a Department of Health official, I can't remember their name, who did say that to me. It's unlikely we'll do anything unless it really happens. So it's a question of, I guess, health economics and risk benefit equations, isn't it, about where the government puts its resources? But I didn't. I mean, I'm not expert on those matters, but I didn't think the DuPont product was very expensive and wouldn't have added much additional cost to surgical procedures are expensive, and the additional cost of using that step I don't think would have been very much. But that's the Department of Health's responsibility to decide where it spends its limited funds, and they didn't seem to want to pursue this. And
that was your understanding, was it? It was an economic decision.
No, I don't really know that, and we were. There were a number of committees involved, in particular one called the Rapid Review Panel, that looked at new products that might be introduced into the NHS, and the concerns they had. We designed this as the letter says, as a pre-soak. There are reasons for that, in that when prawns, when the instruments dry out and the prawns are dried on the surface, they're really hard to get off. You don't really want the instruments to dry. And so our thought of this was that when the surgeons had finished with a tray of instruments, they would be put into a container, bucket of hot water with a sachet of Rely-On PI in it, leave it there for whatever the manufacturer recommended. I think from memory, DuPont recommended about an hour. In experimental terms, it doesn't take that long. Then you'd simply rinse them all in the sink, and then they could go off to the hospital sterilization department just as they would have done normally. And that seemed to us a very straightforward thing to do. That was perhaps naive on my part, because there's quite a bit of pushback on that from hospitals saying, well, actually we want something that works in our existing washer disinfector machines, which was an automated process where they put the instruments in and pressed a button and everything happened. So using our method would have required changes into procedure and change in rotors, and there was quite a lot of discussion about that, I recall, and requests that there weren't any doubts at the Rapid Review Panel that it worked in terms of prawn sterilization, but rather that it wasn't optimal for hospital practice. And I think there were discussions with DuPont about whether a second generation product could be developed that they could put into a machine, an automated washer disinfector. The limiting factor with that was, going to the technical details, but it's about the detergents and not getting too much foaming. This is specialized technology which we knew nothing about. So it would be for DuPont to see if they could develop a second generation product which would be more in keeping with what the health service wanted. But of course by this stage DuPont had lost interest because no one had bought this product, and I don't think they felt it was worth them investing much more money in that. I think that whole area was explored by the House of Common Sense and Technology Committee. I think they asked DuPont to give evidence and talk about what happened there.
Do you ever recall considering or having discussions about whether prions in plasma could contaminate fractionation equipment?
I don't recall being involved in those sort of discussions, no.
Are you able to express any views on that issue?
As to whether it might contaminate equipment? Well, if there are prawns there, they are surface adherent. They do like sticking to surfaces, plastics as well as metal surfaces. We explored a lot of different sorts of surfaces when we were going on to develop the blood test that I know you're going to come on to talk about. But so there's a theoretical concern there that if there are prawns in any substance you're putting through equipment, that they're going to stick to surfaces. That's certainly a possibility.
I'm now going to turn to the much promised questions about the work that you did on developing a blood test for diagnosing VCJD. And we're here talking about the blood test called the direct detection assay, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
The DDA.
Correct.
And is it right to understand that test is currently used by the unit to diagnose those who are symptomatic, to understand whether or not they have VCJD?
Yes, we've used it for that purpose. We haven't had a case of variant CJD for several years now, so it's not used very frequently, but it is still available should we need to do that.
Let me just look at the article in The Lancet, published on February 5th, 2011, NHBT 0033626. So if we just look at the summary, we can see that the first paragraph there just sets out what VCJD is, and then it says the number of asymptomatic individuals with VCJD prion infection is unknown, posing risk to others via blood transfusions, blood products, organ or tissue grafts, and contaminated medical instruments. We aimed to establish the sensitivity and specificity of a blood-based assay for detection of VCJD prion infection. And then under methods, the second half of that paragraph, it says this: to establish the sensitivity and specificity of the assay for detection of endogenous VCJD, we analysed a masked panel of 190 whole blood samples from 21 patients with VCJD, 27 with sporadic CJD, 42 with other neurological diseases, and 100 normal controls. Samples were masked and numbered by individuals independent of the assay and analysis. And each sample was tested twice in independent assay runs. Only samples that were reactive in both runs were scored as positive overall. And then the findings were we were able to distinguish a 10 to the 10 dilution of exogenous VCJD prion infected brain from a 10 to the 6 dilution of normal brain, and then you go on to say an assay sensitivity that was orders of magnitude higher than any previously reported. 15 samples in the masked panel were scored as positive. All 15 samples were from patients with VCJD, showing an assay sensitivity for VCJD of 71.4% and a specificity of 100%. And the interpretation, these initial studies provide a prototype blood test for diagnosis of VCJD in symptomatic individuals, which could allow development of large-scale screening tests for asymptomatic VCJD prion infection. And then if we turn then over to pages 5, please, under discussion, you make some broad points about the blood test. And you say this: evidence shows that there is a risk of iatrogenic secondary VCJD prion infection from transfusion of blood and blood products, and by inference from many forms of surgical and dental interventions. Taken together with the existence of subclinical carrier states of prion disease and the long incubation periods for clinical disease, the implications for current and future public health could be substantial. Current risk reduction strategies in the UK of uncertain efficacy or necessity are very costly to the National Health Service. These strategies include leukodepletion of all transfused packed red cells, sourcing of plasma from the USA, and importing of blood for transfusion to young children. Studies modelling the use of leukocyte depletion have shown reductions in blood infectivity of between 58% and 72%, and the use of prion blood filters is also being considered by the UK Department of Health. So just pausing there, is it right to understand that your view, certainly in 2011, was that if a blood-based assay could be developed, it might actually mean that these steps that have been taken to improve the safety of the blood would no longer be necessary, which could turn out to be an economical decision?
It's possible, yes. I mean, again, that's a sort of risk-benefit calculation for the Department of Health, but it certainly would have led to discussions about if we had a test and could exclude infected donors, would those measures still be necessary?
And then if we go back then to page 4 of the article, so back a page, and just to read a bit more about the detail, right at the bottom there, we then tested the mass panel of 190 samples from 21 patients with confirmed VCJD, 69 patients with other neurological disease and 100 normal healthy controls. 19 samples from the panel were reactive in assay run 1 and 22 in run 2. A subset of 15 samples gave signals greater than the cut-off threshold in both assays and were hence scored as positive. Subsequently, all 15 samples were decoded as true positives obtained from patients with VCJD showing an assay sensitivity of 15 out of 21 or 71.4%. And then samples from 6 patients with VCJD did not score positive during testing of the mass panel. Of those samples, 3 had been reactive in either assay run 1 or 2, but did not react in both assays. The 3 remaining samples were scored as negative in both of the test runs and were indistinguishable from normal controls. So just trying then to understand what this shows us. This shows us that the test has, the DDA, as at 2011, had a 100% specificity. In other words, it won't diagnose any false positives, despite there being samples from people with sporadic CJD and other neurological diseases. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
I think technically it might show, might it, given the confidence intervals, that it's around 100% or approaching 100%, because you can't entirely exclude chance to the level of a couple of percent.
No, these are relatively small numbers that we looked at this stage.
Yes.
We went on to look at much larger numbers.
And that confirmed the same result, did it?
Yes, we looked at 5,000 US blood donors, where there's a country where there'd been minimal exposure to BSE, and all 5,000 were negative. So that gives it, you're correct, there's a sort of confidence interval around the numbers. But 0 out of 5,000 gave us much more confidence that there was a very low false positive rate.
Yep.
And in terms of the sensitivity put at 71.4%, is it right to understand that will diagnose 71% of the positive cases? So you will get some false negatives?
Correct, yes. We missed some true cases with the test, yeah.
And is it then trying to interpret what that 71.4% sensitivity result means? Could it mean, is this right, that it could either mean that the test was not sensitive enough, in other words, it failed to detect prions that were there in the sample, and another explanation could be that there were no infectious particles in the sample. Those are the two explanations. Is that right?
That's correct. You appreciate that the test is done on a very small sample of blood, about 8 microliters. It's a tiny amount of blood. So in some patients, we don't know for sure that everyone that has variant CJD has prions in their blood, first of all, so-called prionemia. But even if they all do, they will have variable levels. They won't all have the same level, and it's possible that some had an infection, but that particular very tiny sample that we analysed didn't have any prions in it.
So 2 explanations for why there may not have been any prions in the samples. One, the sample's simply too small.
Yes.
And that's as a result, is it, of the fact that samples of infected VCJD whole blood are extremely limited?
The samples were certainly limited, but there were technical demands in the test that meant it worked better with small volumes. And we did go on later to try and explore using larger volumes to get around that issue. But the prototype test worked on those volumes, so we didn't know whether that meant the patients that weren't detected on the DDA didn't have any prions in their blood, or they had prions in their blood, but that particular sample that we took didn't have any in. There's another way of looking at the sensitivity. you're talking about the test sensitivity here, but there's also an analytical sensitivity. And that we established, I think you read that out in the paper summary, that so we'd taken known variant CJD prawns, which we had from brain tissue obtained at autopsy from a patient who died of variant CJD, who'd kindly given consent for this research. And what we did is take serial dilutions, serial tenfold dilutions of that material to see how sensitive the test was in detecting variant CJD prawns at all. And we were able to dilute it by 10 logs, so 10 billion times, and still detect prawns in that sample. Now, we don't know how many prawns there are per gram in a human brain because we can't assay prawns in humans. But in animal models where one can do that, the highest levels that are ever seen, typically the levels in the brains of laboratory rodents infected with prawns are of the order of 10 to the 8 infectious units per gram. Occasionally it can go up to 10 to the 10. I'm not aware of any beyond 10 to the 10. So the fact that we could detect at 10 to the minus 10 dilutions suggested we were sort of at the level of a single infectious unit, i.e. the test was exquisitely sensitive. So that didn't prove that the fact we weren't able to detect in some of the patients was a problem with the test, but it certainly opened up the possibility that the reason we weren't detecting is because there weren't any prawns there to detect. And of course, if the purpose of the subsequent screening test is to exclude infected donors from the transfusion service, that their blood isn't used for transfusion, of course the test is taking out all the samples in which you can detect infectivity. So the reduction of infectivity would be expected to be more than 70%.
So, and just picking up that point, because although if it's right that there are no prions in the sample, because although the person from whom the sample has been taken has been diagnosed with VCJD, they are one of the cohort of such patients who don't have prionemia, don't have prions in the blood. Does it follow that their blood is not infectious for the transmission of prion disease, even though they have a transmission of VCJD, even though they have a diagnosis of VCJD?
That would be the implication, but we couldn't say that with absolute confidence because the DDA is detecting abnormal forms of the prion protein sticking to metal surfaces. That's not necessarily the same as infectious units. And to look at infectious units, you have to use a biological assay. So we couldn't be absolute. The DDA isn't measuring prions, as it were. It's measuring abnormal prion proteins. That's perhaps a subtle point, but one that would need to be considered. But the implication would be, yes, if they were testing negative, they were less likely to have significant infection in the blood.
And so the drawing that together, although the sensitivity at 71.4% might, on the surface of it, look low, is it right to understand that you're saying, well, that's a minimum, and that taking all those other matters into account, it's likely to be higher because the most likely explanation for why it hadn't picked up those 6 out of the 21 VCJD samples was because there simply wasn't any prionemia in the
that's certainly a possible explanation, but obviously we couldn't distinguish between those at that time. Of course, this was a prototype test. This was not a final test. This was, I think, an important step forward, but we didn't envisage that the test, as we published it in the Lancet, could then be just used by the blood service. There were many more steps to do to improve it, to make it something that was fit for purpose to be used for blood screening. But I think it was a very promising start in that regard. And of course, the next step, the question about whether this could be used to increase the safety of the blood supply was whether it would detect not just people who got the disease, but carriers. And of course, so we went on to propose further research to see whether it could detect carriers, and that required looking at much larger populations and comparison between BSE exposed and BSE unexposed populations.
And the reason that you had to come up with that method of working to establish how effective the test was at diagnosing asymptomatic VCJD carriers is because there are no whole blood samples from anyone who's gone on to develop VCJD. Is that right?
So far as I'm aware, in fact, when we did this research, we weren't aware that there were any samples available from such individuals, and that's why the research developed in the way that it did. It was only much later that it came to light, to me at least, I think around 2016, that in fact the blood service did have samples from patients that had gone on to develop variant CJD, and we were quite surprised by that because those offered a potentially rather quick way to finding out whether the test would work. And we asked for more details about that, and so far as I'm aware, there weren't any whole blood samples, which is what our test had been. Since we didn't know, of course, where the prawns were in blood, we didn't pre-fractionated it. We wanted to capture the prawns from the whole blood sample. But I think the only samples that were available weren't considered suitable for the test. I think had we known about them when we were developing this test, we certainly would have looked at them, and it may have affected the way that the test developed. I don't know. But as I say, we didn't know any such samples existed at the time.
And so you were starting to tell us that the plan to try and establish how effective the DDA was for asymptomatic VCJD carriers required you to look at large samples of unexposed populations, unexposed to VCJD populations, and then to look at an exposed UK population. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
can you explain to us why that would tell us how effective the DDA test is for asymptomatic VCJD carriers?
So we had no samples from people that we knew were carriers, and there's no other test, so that there's no gold standard of saying, well, these are samples from carriers, can you detect them? So all we could do was to take, and our statistical power calculations suggested 20,000 was about the right number. In a previous proposal, I think HPA had suggested 50,000, but we thought we could do it with 20,000. So in the UK, you have a population that's been widely exposed to BSE prawns. The US has had essentially no exposure. So if you compared 20,000 American samples and 20,000 British samples, and let's say you found 7 or 8 positives in the British and none in the Americans, and we'd expect to see none in the Americans. We'd already tested 5,000 Americans and found none. Then you could conclude 2 things. One is it's detecting carriers, and secondly, that there is a problem in the UK blood supply. And I think both of those things would have then, I hoped, encouraged the diagnostics industry to then pick up what was an academic lab-based test and turn it into something that the blood service could actually use, which was beyond our competence or abilities.
And you say it's beyond your competence and abilities to develop the academic work into something that can be used by the blood services. Presumably it also requires a large amount of investment in terms of,
yes,
of money, time, and so on, which was, again, was that beyond the capability of your unit?
Yeah, well, we didn't have that sort of expertise. What it needed is to it's quite a laborious method in the lab. It needed to be turned into something that was high throughput and robust and could be used in routine hospital laboratories. And the diagnostics industry, have commercial platforms in which tests are run with proprietary technologies, and we saw it was for the industry to pick that up and take it forward. It's not something we could do. In fact, any work we did do to try and semi-automate it or develop it was likely to be wasted, because any company that took it up would want to use their own proprietary technologies rather than any in-house things we thought through.
And is it right to understand your evidence that you nevertheless did make efforts to get a commercial company interested, but you came across this barrier that actually the studies that you've described to us, large populations of exposed and unexposed, populations exposed to VCJD and unexposed to VCJD needed to be carried out first before anyone would bite.
Yes, I mean, I think you've seen correspondence I had with the then Chief Medical Officer Sally Davis and the Public Health Minister, and you know, I went in to inform the department when we had the test and discussed this, and Sally Davis's advice was, you know, you've done some very nice work, you've taken it as far as you should as academics, now, you know, it should be left for industry, for the market to move forward. The problem with, you know, if that had been the case, I would have been delighted. But the reality is, and we did have discussions with the help of the then Deputy Chief Executive of the Medical Research Council that funded us, who actually conveniently had previously worked in the diagnostic industry and was a good source of advice, and MRC Technology, which was the technology transfer arm of the MRC. We did have discussions with a number of the major diagnostics companies, and a number of companies have been trying independently to develop blood tests, as you probably saw from the evidence of the House of Commons inquiry, although they hadn't succeeded. But the companies we talked to were of the view of, well, you know, is there a market for this? You know, you don't know whether there is a significant problem with praonemia in the UK population, and you don't know whether your test can detect them anyway. So there was this hurdle to get over before they would consider investing, you know, many millions of pounds to produce a robust test that could be used by the blood service. And so we went back to the issue of thinking, well, this prevalence study of, you know, how many UK donors are positive versus American donors, we needed those data to convince anybody to take it any further forward. So we were in a bind there that, you know, the commercial companies wanted to see more data, and we were unable to get funding to do that study.
I think in your evidence to the House of Commons, you referred to it as the Valley of Death. Is that right? It's a sort of catch-22. It's
a rather unfortunate phrase considering what we're talking about here, but,
yes.
But it is a commonly used phrase in business. It's about, you know, academics develop some technology to a particular point as far as they can as academics, and the industry who can turn it into a real product which is going to, you know, benefit patients' lives is on the other side of the valley, and you get stuck in this valley where you haven't been able to do quite enough as academics, and on the other side they still see it as too high risk for them to invest. So that's what the term Valley of Death is usually used to refer to. I think that's where we were.
I'd like to pick it up with you on the 25th of October 2012. It's DHSC 5261711. So this is a draft minute from a joint meeting of the ACDP-TSE Risk Assessment Subgroup and the UK Blood Services Prion Working Group. Now, you were not a member of either of those groups, were you, in October 2012? And we can see there the present, who's present. And if we go over the page, please, we can see a long list of observers as well, and officials, various different organisations, and then at the bottom, or in the middle, presenters, we've got someone from SMBTS, if we go up a bit, someone from Prionics, and then we've got Dr. Graham Jackson from the MRC Prion unit. What was his role at the unit?
Graham led the diagnostics research group, so it was his group that developed the blood test within the unit.
Now, this is not a meeting that you attended. It's presumably not a meeting in which you received the minutes after the meeting, is that right? No. So the first time you would have seen these minutes was because the inquiry sent them to you in preparation for today. That aside, I'd just like to pick up with you some of the what's in the minutes. It's quite to ask you what you were aware of at the time. If we can turn, please, to page 5. Now, if we look at the whole of this page, we can see that I want to take you to paragraphs 2.5, which is a discussion that seems to be taking place before agenda item 3, which we can see at the bottom of the page. Sorry, can we just have the whole page for a moment? Agenda item 3, which is the presentation from Dr. Jackson on the MRC prion unit assay. So then if we go to paragraph 2.5, we can see the discussion that's taking place by the members of the joint committees. And they're talking about the prevalence study here. How could this affect the assessment of measures to reduce the risk of secondary VCJD transmission? The availability of a blood test would likely result in a reduction in the risk of onward transmission. However, some idea of the sensitivity and specificity of the test used would be needed. And then it says a decrease in the budget to fund CJD research was noted, as was the lack of interest of commercial companies to carry on with CJD-related work. A blood prevalence study would be a sensible step that would contribute to the evidence base. Were you aware in 2016 about this decrease in the budget for CJD research?
Not specifically. I mean, the Department of Health had put a lot of CJD specific. They had a ring-fence budget for CJD. I know that was that sort of period being phased out. I don't know the specifics of it.
And then it goes on at 2.6 to say, members agreed that a test with high specificity rather than sensitivity would be required for a prevalence study, whereas the opposite would apply, i.e. high sensitivity for use in an individual patient. Now, is it right to understand that this is what you had been saying to the MRC and to, certainly to the MRC when you've been applying for funding to carry out a prevalence study, that although there was a 71.4% sensitivity to your test, that didn't matter for a prevalence study because you had very high specificity?
That's correct. When you do the statistical power calculations to decide what size of study you need to answer the question, if you start getting false positives, if your test isn't sufficiently specific, you need huge numbers. But if you have, as we had at that stage, 100% specificity, then you could do it with sensible size numbers. The actual sensitivity to detect the individual cases was much less important as long as it was reasonable. So the fact that it was 70% rather than 100% just simply meant you needed to use slightly larger numbers. If the test had been picking up 1 in 100 false positives, the whole thing wouldn't have been possible at all. So yes, it was the specificity that really mattered to do the prevalence study, and that was 100%.
And then it goes on to say, would more than one test need to be available? There was general support more than one test would need to be available for a blood prevalence study. Ideally, one test would be used for primary testing, and this would be supported by 1 or 2 further confirmatory tests. And it was noted that a use of a confirmatory test could only reduce the measured prevalence, as some of the primary test results would be false positive. However, once again, it was emphasised that it's still not known exactly what these tests are detecting. So do you agree with what's being said there, that ideally you would have 1 or 2 confirmatory tests when you're carrying out a prevalence study?
A confirmatory test is always nice to have, but I don't think it was essential for what we were proposing. It would have been probably considered essential by the blood service for its use in practice, blood donors, when you had positives, given the importance of that and the Department of Health's view that should be fed, information should be fed back to donors. I think you'd want a confirmatory test to be sure. But in terms of doing this initial prevalence survey, that wasn't necessary in my opinion.
And then we go on to see that Dr. Jackson gives his presentation, and we can just go over the page. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of issues there. He makes the point at the third bullet point down, the 71% sensitivity of this assay could be due to absent prionemia in some samples. It had not been possible to test repeat samples from the same donors. So that's the point that you were making earlier, is it?
Yes, the volume of blood that we were doing the assay on, 8 microlitres, may simply not contain prawns in some of the samples. And the number of blood samples that was available from patients was inherently quite small, and often, usually in fact, there was only a single blood sample from a patient. We hadn't been able to take serial samples throughout their illness.
And then if we can go over then to page 9, we'll see that there's a general discussion. And if we go down to 7.2, comments, blood test, we can see that the group agreed that this was the most promising of the 4 tests presented, but that some further development would be required before this test could be in a blood prevalence study. And there's some comments there, so I'm not quite clear whose comments these are. I think this is the only copy of minutes from this meeting that we found to date. It doesn't look like a final draft. And then if we go over the page, we can see the first bullet point down, the point being made, there is great variation in peripheral PRP between patients with VCJD. The working assumption is that there are also very variable levels of prionemia in VCJD. So that was the point, again, that you were making earlier, is it?
That's right, yeah. We simply didn't know the answer to those questions.
And then the summary, halfway down the page, is it was agreed that this test needs further development but has potential for use in a blood prevalence study. And that seems to be, and then if we go over to page 12, we can see the summary and future steps that this group are concluding. 8.1, MRC Prawn unit test was the only test of the 4 presented that can be considered for a blood prevalence study in the near future. And then there's a discussion about budgets and so on, and the capping of the CJD research budget. And it says at the bottom of 8.4, the 2 further appendix studies should be given priority over a new blood prevalence study if funding was not sufficient to cover all 3. And then 8.5, development of the assays and a study protocol could continue whilst the appendix studies were performed with a view to funding beginning the prevalence study after the conclusion of the appendix studies, should such a study address DH policy's needs then. And then over the page 8.10, the point being made that all possible sources of blood should be explored beyond that of the blood and tissue services, and the biobank was suggested as a possible source. So that seems to be the position of the joint of that meeting in 2012. Were those messages communicated to you at the Prawns unit, do you recall?
Not formally in any way. I don't recall getting any correspondence on it.
But in any event, it looks fairly positive at that stage from this meeting minute note. But that's not something that was communicated to you.
No, I mean I probably had conversations with Graham Jackson, but I didn't have any formal correspondence that I can recall from either of those committees at that stage.
And you then set out in your witness statement the attempts you make to secure funding from the MRC for the prevalence studies, and I don't intend to go to that, but it might be helpful to look at one of the letters that you sent to Dr. Catherine Elliott, who's the Director of Clinical Research Interests at the MRC. That's PRIU 5074. So this is a letter dated the 17th of April 2013, and it's called Application of Blood Testing to Estimate UK VCJD Prion Infection Prevalence. and you are going back to her, the MRC having turned down a funding application. You say in the second paragraph that you're very concerned by the reasons given for the decision and felt it was essential to respond to the comments, given the potential public health implications of not progressing the work at that time. And you go, if we could go over the page, please. You make the point, you say this, from a public health perspective, that second paragraph down, it should be noted that the most conservative interpretation of our current prototype test still means we could reduce prion exposure of blood and blood product recipients by 71%. So that's the point, again, that we were discussing earlier, is it?
That's right, yes.
And then you say this again, can I emphasise that the proposed study is not aimed at a definitive prevalence study of VCJD prionemia in the UK population. It is, as we discussed some time ago with John Saville, the second stage of work required to evaluate the prototype test to the stage where a major diagnostics company could take up the necessary subsequent development. We presume formal prevalence studies would then be performed by others with statutory responsibilities in this area. And then you go on to say that you haven't been able to develop to secure a commercial partner. But in effect, all of the applications and correspondence with the MRC came to nothing, is that right? They didn't fund the prevalence studies.
That's right, yes.
But was there some renewed interest in trying to get the test out of the valley of death, if I can put it that way, following the publication in July 2014 of the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee after the storm, because they had recommended that a large-scale VCJD prevalence study should be initiated within the UK within the next 12 months.
That's right, that was the committee's recommendation.
And we see set out in your witness statement quite a lot of correspondence between, at that stage, the company Degen that you were telling us about this morning and the ACDP TSE group we looked at, whose minutes we looked at a moment ago, and the NHSBT, to and froing about how this how to progress this. And that culminated in a meeting in September 2016, which I will just take you to before we break for lunch, and that is PHEN 302461. So we can see here that we've got the ACDP TSE subgroup, 29th of September.
If I could say before you go on, just for clarification, I think there was a further meeting I had with Dame Sally Davis, the CMO, and said, look, we just can't go any further. Also, MRC had withdrawn the funding of Dr. Jackson's group, so the unit had no real capability to take things any further forward. And I'd said to Dame Sally, look, we've done what we can. If you want to take this any further forward, then discuss this with Degen that owns the to whom the IP had been assigned, as I explained earlier. And if we can help in any way with taking that forward, let us know. But I'd essentially passed that on at that stage because I didn't think there was anything else we could do as a unit.
And that was in 2014?
It was there is correspondence I think you have with the Chief Medical Officer about that. I can't remember exactly.
So again, I'm showing you minutes from a meeting that you didn't attend because you weren't on the group, and we can see their invited experts include again Dr. Graham Jackson. But again, I'm showing these to you. Again, presumably you wouldn't have seen these minutes because you were not a member of the group, and the first time you've seen them is because the inquiries provided them to you. Is that right?
As far as I'm aware, yeah.
The reason I'm showing them to you and asking you questions is again on the same basis as the last document that I did this, was to understand whether or not the messages and decisions made here were communicated to the unit. So can we go please to page 8? We can see there at 6.1, 6.0, it says preclinical detection of infectivity. If we just go up a bit, yeah, 6.0, sorry. Preclinical detection of infectivity and disease-specific PRP in blood throughout the incubation period of prion disease. That seems to be a paper. So it's 6.1. I thought that was the title. And then the chair welcomes Graham Jackson and Bernard Jollies from the prion unit in DGen. And then we can see that at paragraph 6.3, Mark Turner is invited to introduce the item and explain the importance of the committee gaining a better understanding of the DDA, and the committee being reminded of the House and Commons Select and Technology Committee conclusion about developing a reliable test to help prevent inadvertent horizontal transmission between people via surgical instruments or blood, and then the role of the ACDBP-TSE subgroup to advise on the utility of assays under development, including its suitability for population-level study of some kind in the future. And then if we go down to 6.4, Dr. Jackson introduces a paper, and he says that the need had been acknowledged of demonstrating that the DDA test was capable of detecting signal in blood samples at preclinical stages of the disease. And then if we go to 6 point, over the page, please. We can see at 6.8, the recent MV VCJD case is tested negative using the DDA. This could suggest that the DDA results may be affected by the genotype of the individual being tested, and this would affect the interpretation of any results in any population being studied. It is recognised that this could also be true for other assays, but this was not known at this time. And then 6.9, the importance of using more than one test. In effect, an initial and a confirmatory test was raised. It was agreed that it would be essential for 2 or more tests performed consistently over different same populations. And then if we go down then to paragraph 6.14, 6.13. It was clear to the committee that a population-based study could take several forms. It might be used in an attempt to clarify the appendix study results. Equally, it might be used in settings where there was a transmission risk to help inform public health protection measures. For the latter, particularly for blood safety, it was acknowledged that an adequately performing test that detected disease pre-clinically was needed. Some questioned whether a population-based study was the reasonable next step for the latter. And then the decision of the committee is in the next paragraph. It was concluded by the committee that ideally there should be a comparative study carried out using at least 2 different assays. This would allow for relative sensitivity and specificity between tests to be examined. The DDA was suggested as the initial screen, but this was not supported. It was questioned whether it was feasible to carry out tests on a high enough number of samples for all the assays, as this would require tens of thousands of samples to be tested. This would have to be a large-scale study and would take time and resource to complete. So that is seems to be the conclusion of the meeting. Again, do you recall whether or not that message was fed back to the unit, that this group, who were responsible for advising on the utility of assays, didn't support the DDA as the initial screen for a prevalence study?
Again, I can't recall them actually writing to me, although this is a long time ago. There's a huge amount of correspondence here. I'm sure I will have talked to Dr. Jackson and Bernard Jollies, who were at the meeting, about this. But it's the background to this, and I don't understand what they mean with two different assays there. I mean, there were other assays being developed that didn't come to fruition, including by members of this committee, who therefore had some conflicts of interest. But what had become a real problem here is that a number of companies had been trying to develop tests over a period of time and needed access to variant CJD samples to validate them. These samples were extremely scarce, and a lot of the companies were asking for unfeasible amounts of material. And so a subcommittee was set up to determine access, to set criteria by which companies could have access to this. And this involved, because the human samples were so scarce, involved showing activity in some animal models beforehand. Now, I think what this committee was getting at, and why Graham Jackson was invited to present that paper, which was highlighted there, was because we'd pointed out that we'd already shown it works on human samples. What's the point of going back to look at animal samples? And as I've already alluded to earlier in my evidence, the combination of particular prawn strains and particular animal hosts, they're all different. And you couldn't directly extrapolate from animal data to human data. If the test worked in, I think they were suggesting sheep and macaque samples, if they worked or didn't work in those wouldn't necessarily tell you whether it worked or didn't work in humans. And since we'd already shown it worked in humans, this seemed to me to be completely pointless and also would be extremely time-consuming to redevelop the test to work on different sorts of samples. And there was a lot of discussion about this. Graham Jackson was actually doing some research for a different reason, looking at biomarkers. So his diagnostics group by this stage was no longer funded by MRC. And in the course of that, he looked at a mouse model and taken samples which were tested using the DDA during the incubation period. And he was able to show positives during the incubation period, and we published this. And I think that's why he was invited to this committee to show this, because although we didn't think there was any purpose at all in looking at the DDA in animal samples, this committee seemed to think that was essential. But this paper showed that, okay, if you want those data, they're already here and published. So I think that was sort of the background to this, as I recall it, that there was an attempt to put the DDA through a historical validation pathway, which was completely irrelevant. Indeed, would have wasted years of work, and would not have informed, in my opinion, progression to a human test at all.
And did you understand why the DDA being suggested as the initial screen was not supported?
I don't understand that. I mean, I as I say, I read this document when the inquiry kindly provided it to me, and it doesn't really, as with some of these other minutes, it doesn't really explain why these conclusions were reached. The House of Commons Select Committee, of course, took wide evidence from a large number of experts before reaching their conclusion.
So I've trespassed into past 1 o'clock. I wonder if now is a convenient time to take a lunch break. I don't have very many more questions for Professor Collinge, but I have another sort of 10, 15 minutes, I would have thought.
Yes, well, perhaps you can pick up the any questions which thus far
Yes.
those who represent core participants may have to add. But otherwise, we'll take a break in any event until 2:10. 2:10.